I stood alone in the shadowed courtyard of Vanderbilt University Hospital, the spring air thick with the cloying perfume of dogwood blossoms, their sweetness a cruel taunt against the despair clawing at my chest. My hands gripped the splintered edge of a weathered wooden bench, knuckles white as bone, as if I could anchor myself against the tide of grief threatening to drown me. Behind those cold, gleaming glass walls, my husband, Daniel Carter, lay in the ICU, his body tethered to machines, his life unraveling like a threadbare tapestry. I'm a nurse, trained to save lives, to stitch together broken bodies, but I was powerless to save the man who was my entire world. The world spun on around me. Strangers laughed, their voices soft and careless, planning dinners or weekend escapes, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. Each beep of those machines was a countdown, a relentless reminder that time was slipping away. I felt like a ghost, haunting my own life, watching it fracture piece by piece. My world had narrowed to a hospital room, to the relentless rhythm of monitors, to the sight of Daniel's pale face against a sterile pillow. Then, in a fleeting moment, I overheard something, a whisper, a shadow of hope wrapped in mystery. It was a spark in the darkness, fragile but fierce, and it ignited something within me, a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. This is my story, a tale of love tested by betrayal, of secrets buried in forgotten corners of the world, and of a strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to fight for it. My name is Emily Carter, and this is how I walked through the fire of loss, through the shadows of despair, and found a miracle in the ashes. 5 years ago, life was a dream painted in hues of gold and amber, a canvas of hope and possibility. Daniel and I were newlyweds, nestled in a creaky wooden house on the outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee. It was no grand estate. Peeling paint clung stubbornly to the clapboard walls. The porch sagged under the weight of our dreams, and the windows rattled with every gust of wind. But it was ours, a sanctuary carved from love and determination. Daniel was a craftsman, his calloused hands coaxing stories from oak and cedar, shaping wood into furniture that felt alive with purpose. He'd come home late, sawdust dusting his worn jeans, his piercing blue eyes catching the fading sunlight, that crooked half-smile stealing my breath every time. "Em," he'd say, his voice warm as a summer night. "This is just the start. We'll have a big house one day, kids tearing through the yard, maybe a dog that'll chew my boots to shreds." I'd laugh, leaning into his warmth, my head resting against his chest, the steady beat of his heart a promise I believed with every fiber of my being. He had a gift for turning the mundane into magic, for weaving wonder into the everyday. A jar of honey from a roadside stand, its amber glow catching the light on our scarred kitchen table, a treasure he'd present with a shy grin. Wildflowers tied with butcher paper, left on my pillow with a note in his careful script. "You are my always." A bookshelf he built late at night, its edges carved with tiny stars, because I'd once told him I loved stargazing as a child. Those were the days when love felt like a fortress, unyielding, eternal, a shield against the world's cruelties. We'd sit on our porch, rocking in the chair he'd crafted for our first anniversary, its wood polished to a warm glow, watching fireflies dance in the Tennessee twilight. We'd talk of the future, of vacations we couldn't yet afford, of a bigger house filled with the laughter of children, of a life stretching out like an open road. But even then, there was a shadow I didn't see, a crack in the foundation of our perfect life, a betrayal woven into the very fabric of our story, waiting to split wide open. It began so quietly, so insidiously, we barely noticed the change. Daniel started coming home early from the workshop, his face pale, his smile flickering like a candle in a storm. "Just a long day, Em," he'd say, brushing it off with that easy charm, his voice light, but his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. The exhaustion lingered, sinking deeper, carving hollows under his eyes, stealing the strength from his hands that once shaped wood with such certainty. Then came the bruises. Small at first, like he'd bumped a workbench in his shop, faint marks I could dismiss as accidents. But soon they bloomed without reason, purple and angry, spreading across his arms, his legs, his chest, like omens written in his skin. I'd catch him staring at them in the bathroom mirror, his brow furrowed. But he'd shrug and say, "It's nothing, Em. Don't worry." But I did worry. I worried because I'm a nurse, because I've seen the signs of sickness too many times, because the man I loved was slipping away, and I didn't know why. One night, I woke to the sound of him gasping, a ragged, desperate sound that tore through the quiet of our bedroom. He was clutching his chest, his face pale, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, as if the air had turned to shards of glass. His eyes, wide with fear he tried to hide, met mine in the dark, and my heart seized. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What's wrong?" He tried to smile to reassure me, but it faltered, and I saw the truth in his eyes. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. I'm a nurse. I've seen sickness, faced death in sterile hospital rooms, comforted families as they said goodbye. But this was different. This was Daniel, my anchor, my safe harbor, the man who'd promised me forever. I begged him to see a doctor, my voice sharp with a fear I couldn't contain, my hands shaking as I dialed the appointment line. He resisted at first, his stubborn pride flaring, insisting he was fine, that it was just fatigue. But when he finally agreed, his reluctance heavy with unspoken dread, I clung to the hope it was something simple, a vitamin deficiency, a passing illness, a problem with a name we could fight. We sat in the hematologist's office, the air cold and heavy, the walls closing in as we waited for answers. The doctor's face was too serious, his words too deliberate, each one a blade slicing through my hope. "Daniel," he said, his voice steady but grave, "you have aplastic anemia. It's rare, severe. Your bone marrow is failing to produce blood cells." The room tilted, the world blurring at the edges. My breath caught, trapped in my chest, as if I'd forgotten how to breathe. Daniel, ever calm, ever steady, just nodded, his hand finding mine under the table, squeezing gently. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm, as if he could will the answer to be simple. The doctor's response was both clear and impossible. "You need a bone marrow transplant. Without it, your body can't survive." But the real betrayal, the twist of fate that gutted me, that felt like a knife in my heart, was the need for a close match, ideally a sibling. Daniel, my orphan husband, had no family, raised in foster care, bounced from home to home. He'd never known his parents, never known if he had brothers or sisters. His past was a blank page, a void we couldn't fill. We signed up for the National Donor Registry immediately, but the doctors were brutally honest. Finding a compatible stranger could take months, years. Daniel had weeks, maybe less. The weight of that truth settled over me like a shroud, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, threatening to swallow me whole. Days melted into a haze of hospital rooms, sterile white walls, and the relentless beeping of monitors that haunted my dreams, each sound a reminder of time slipping away. Daniel, the man who once carried oak beams like they weighed nothing, who built our life with his bare hands, now trembled lifting a glass of water. His skin was pale as moonlight, his hands shaking, his once strong frame shrinking before my eyes, as if the disease was stealing him piece by piece. Yet he still tried to make me laugh, his voice weak but warm, a flicker of his old self breaking through. "These hospital gowns," he'd tease, a ghost of his crooked smile flickering, "really bring out my eyes, don't they?" I'd force a smile, my lips trembling, my heart breaking with every forced laugh. Inside, I was shattering, pieces of me fracturing with every labored breath he took. Every moment, he faded a little more. Every night, I'd slip into the hospital bathroom, locking the door behind me, muffling my sobs with a towel so he wouldn't hear. The cold tiles pressed against my knees as I sank to the floor, tears streaming, my chest heaving with the weight of it all. I was a nurse, damn it, trained to heal, to fight death, to bring comfort to those in pain. I'd held hands, wiped tears, watched lives slip away. But nothing prepared me for this, for watching the man I loved, the man who was my home, fade into a shadow of himself. I'd stand at his bedside, holding his hand, whispering, "We'll get through this." But the words felt hollow, a lie I told us both to keep the darkness at bay. Every test, every transfusion, every day that passed without a donor match felt like a step closer to the edge, a precipice I couldn't bear to face. The doctors didn't sugarcoat the truth. One afternoon, after another round of transfusions that did little to slow the disease's relentless march, the hematologist pulled me aside, his voice heavy with pity, his eyes avoiding mine. "Emily," he said, his words measured, careful, "we're running out of options. Without a donor soon." He didn't finish, but the weight of his words crushed me, a boulder pressing down on my chest. I knew what he meant. Prepare to lose him. The word goodbye was a betrayal, a surrender I refused to accept. But grief was relentless, coiling around my heart like icy vines, whispering of a future I couldn't bear to imagine. I saw it in my mind, our porch empty, the rocking chair Daniel built for our first anniversary still and silent, that note by the kitchen door, "You are my always," a cruel echo of a promise breaking. I hated myself for imagining it, for letting those thoughts creep in, but they came unbidden, dark and cold, like shadows I couldn't outrun. I tried to be strong for Daniel, to be his rock as he'd always been mine. I'd sit by his bed, holding his hand, my fingers tracing the lines of his palm, memorizing every callus, every scar, as if I could hold him here through sheer will. He'd look at me, his blue eyes still bright despite the exhaustion, and whisper, "I'm not going anywhere, Em." But I saw the fear he tried to hide, the way his hand trembled in mine, the way his breath caught when he thought I wasn't looking. I'd seen death before, patients I'd cared for, families I'd comforted. But nothing prepared me for this. Nothing prepared me for the thought of a world without Daniel's laugh, his touch, his steady presence. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of it pulling me under, and yet I couldn't let go. I wouldn't. I couldn't imagine a life where our porch was silent, where his workshop stood empty, where the future we'd dreamed of was nothing but a memory. Then, it happened. I'd escaped to the hospital courtyard, desperate for air, for a moment to steady myself before I broke completely. The sun was warm, the dogwoods blooming in a riot of white and pink, but their beauty felt like a lie, a facade hiding the truth of my crumbling world. I sat on a bench, my hands clasped tightly, my nails digging into my palms, trying to anchor myself against the storm inside. That's when I heard them, two nurses on break, sitting on a bench nearby, their voices low, careless, unaware I was listening. "You know that guy in ICU, Carter. He looks just like this guy from Pine Hollow. I swear they could be twins." My heart stopped, the world narrowing to those words, each one a spark in the darkness. Pine Hollow, a tiny mountain town 2 hours east of Nashville, a place I'd visited once during nursing school for a community outreach program. The name conjured images of old wooden bridges, dusty streets, and people who waved at strangers like they were neighbors. A coincidence? Maybe. But something inside me, a spark, a whisper, a pull I couldn't explain, screamed it was more. Daniel had no family, or so we thought. He'd grown up in foster care, abandoned at birth, his past a blank slate. Could this man in Pine Hollow be a brother? A donor? A lifeline? Their words echoed like a riddle, a secret buried in plain sight, a thread I had to follow. I didn't know his name, didn't know if it was real, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was going to find him. Pine Hollow was a forgotten speck on the map, a town where time seemed to pause, where life moved at the pace of a lazy river. Old wooden bridges creaked under the weight of passing trucks, dusty streets wound through fields of wildflowers, and folks waved at strangers with a warmth that felt like home. I'd been there once, years ago, during nursing school, helping vaccinate kids in a community hall that smelled of pine and history. The memory was faint, a snapshot blurred by time, but now Pine Hollow was my only hope, a beacon in the darkness threatening to swallow my world. I took emergency leave from work, my boss's knowing hug a silent acknowledgement of Daniel's fading time. She didn't ask questions, just signed the form and whispered, "Go get your miracle, Emily." Her words lingered, a spark of hope I clung to as I packed a bag, my hands trembling with purpose and dread. I went to Daniel's room one last time before I left, my heart heavy with the secret I carried. He was awake, propped up by pillows, his face pale but his eyes brightening when he saw me. "You look like you're about to take on the world," he teased, his voice weak but warm, that crooked smile flickering like a candle refusing to go out. I knelt beside him, kissing his forehead, my lips lingering on his skin, memorizing the feel of him. "I might be," I whispered, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. He tried to ask more, his brow furrowing, but I stopped him, my hand cupping his cheek. "Don't worry, okay? Just rest. I'll be back before you know it." I couldn't tell him about Pine Hollow. Not yet. I couldn't risk raising his hopes only to shatter them if this was nothing. The weight of that secret felt like a stone in my chest, but I carried it. Because I had to. Because I'd do anything to save him. The drive was a blur, the highway giving way to narrow, winding roads lined with wildflowers and towering pines, their branches swaying in the breeze. Rain fell, a fine mist smearing the world outside my windshield, mirroring the uncertainty swirling in my mind. I clutched Daniel's photo on my phone, his blue eyes, his crooked smile, the face I loved more than life itself. If this man in Pine Hollow looked like him, could he be the key to saving him? Could he be family, a brother Daniel never knew he had? The thought was a fragile thread, but I clung to it, my hands trembling on the wheel as I drove deeper into the unknown, the rain tapping a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat urging me forward. I parked outside a weathered general store, its faded sign creaking in the wind, the words Pine Hollow Mercantile barely legible under years of sun and rain. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee, old wood, and something faintly sweet, like molasses or homemade jam. The clerk, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a weathered face, looked up from behind the counter, his hands pausing as he sorted a stack of receipts. My heart pounded, my voice shaking as I stepped forward, holding up my phone with Daniel's photo. "I'm looking for someone," I said, my words tumbling out, unsteady but urgent. "I don't know his name, but they say he looks like this." The clerk leaned closer, his eyes widening, a spark of recognition flashing across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice warm but tinged with surprise. "That's Luke Henderson. Lives out on County Road 6 by the cornfields. Looks just like him, no question." Spitting image. My pulse surged, a rush of adrenaline flooding my veins, hope and fear tangling in my chest. Luke Henderson. A name. A lead. A thread to pull. The clerk scribbled directions on a scrap of paper, his handwriting uneven but clear, and I thanked him, my voice barely above a whisper, my hands trembling as I took the paper. I drove through the drizzle, the road to County Road. 6 a stretch of cracked pavement, flanked by fields of corn stubble, their skeletal remains swaying in the wind like ghosts of a forgotten harvest. A rusted swing creaked in the distance, a lonely sound, and a dog barked somewhere beyond the trees, its voice sharp in the quiet. A mailbox loomed ahead, the name Henderson painted in peeling white letters, faded but unmistakable. This was it. I knocked, my heart thundering so loud I thought it might drown out the world. No answer. I knocked harder, the sound echoing in the quiet, my breath catching in my throat. My hands shook, my mind racing with possibilities. What if this was a mistake? What if I was chasing a ghost? But I thought of Daniel, his frail hand in mine, his smile hiding the fear in his eyes, and I knocked again, harder, desperate. The door creaked open, and there he was, Luke Henderson, taller than Daniel, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped, with dark blonde hair falling loosely over his forehead. And his eyes? God, his eyes. They were Daniel's, piercing blue, sharp and intense, like a mirror reflecting my husband's soul. My breath caught, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I held it up, my voice breaking. "This is my husband, Daniel Carter," I said, tears burning my eyes. "They say you look like him." Luke stared at the photo, his face shifting. Confusion, disbelief, then something raw, something deep, like pain he'd carried for years. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, his voice rough, cautious, like someone who hadn't had to entertain strangers often. "Who are you?" "Emily," I said, my throat tight, my heart pounding. "I'm his wife." He stepped aside, his expression softening but guarded, his eyes searching mine for answers. "You better come in." Luke's house was humble, almost austere. Worn wood floors scuffed by years of footsteps, mismatched furniture arranged without care, a single lamp casting a warm but feeble glow that couldn't chase away the shadows clinging to the walls. The air smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil, a lived-in scent that spoke of a solitary life. I sat clutching my bag in my lap, my heart pounding, my fingers digging into the worn fabric as if it could ground me. I poured out the story, the words spilling like water from a broken dam. Daniel's illness, the aplastic anemia eating away at his life, the desperate need for a bone marrow transplant, the impossible odds without a family match. My voice trembled, breaking with every sentence, but I kept going, driven by the image of Daniel lying in that hospital bed, his life hanging by a thread. Luke listened, his eyes locked on Daniel's photo, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so hard his knuckles paled. Then he spoke, his voice low, cracking like dry wood underfoot. "I think he might be my brother." The words hit me like a thunderclap, stealing my breath, shaking the ground beneath me. "Your brother?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, as if saying it louder might shatter the fragile truth. My heart raced, hope and disbelief tangling in my chest, a storm of emotions I could barely contain. He nodded, his gaze distant, haunted, as if he were looking through the years to a memory he'd buried deep. Our mom wasn't much of a mother, he said, his voice rough with old pain, each word heavy with regret. She had a lot of kids, different fathers. None of us planned, none of us wanted. Not really. When I was little, 5, maybe 6, she had another boy. I remember her holding him in the hospital, her face cold, distant, like she'd already made up her mind. She said she wasn't keeping him, signed papers, left him there, walked away without looking back. I was too young to understand, too young to do anything, but I never forgot. I can still see his little face, those blue eyes, so much like mine. I never knew his name. Until now. Tears burned my eyes, hot and unrelenting, spilling down my cheeks as I listened. Daniel had spent his life believing he was alone, an orphan with no roots, no kin, no one to claim him. He'd carried that ache like a weight, a quiet wound he rarely spoke of, though I'd seen it in his eyes on late nights when he'd stare out at the stars, wondering who he came from, who he might have belonged to. And here was Luke, a brother he'd never known, carrying the same scar, the same unanswered questions, the same longing for a family lost. But there was something else in Luke's voice, guilt, sharp and jagged, like a blade turned inward. I tried to find her once, he admitted, his eyes dropping to the floor, his hands rubbing together as if to erase the past. Our mom. Years ago, when I was old enough to ask questions, found out she'd died. Overdose. Not long after she left him. I never thought to look for him. I should have tried harder. Anger flared in me, hot and sudden, a fire I couldn't contain. Why hadn't he searched? Why had he let Daniel grow up alone, believing he was unwanted, unmoored, a boy with no one to call his own? The question burned, a scream trapped in my throat, but as I looked at Luke, I saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of a life shaped by the same abandonment Daniel had endured. He wasn't the enemy. The real betrayal was their mother's, cold and final, signing away her son without a backward glance, leaving him to a system that let him slip through the cracks. The real betrayal was the years that kept these brothers strangers, the past that stole their chance to know each other until now, when time was running out. "He's dying," I said, my voice breaking, tears streaming down my face, my hands shaking as I clutched Daniel's photo. "He needs a bone marrow transplant. You could save him." Luke stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He grabbed his truck keys from a hook by the door, his movements quick, decisive. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm, unwavering, his eyes meeting mine with a resolve that matched my own. "The transplant. He's my brother. If there's a chance I can help him live, I'm in. No question." I stared, stunned, my breath catching in my throat. I'd braced for resistance, for doubt, for a fight to convince him, but Luke's certainty was like a lifeline thrown into the dark, a beacon cutting through the storm. "When do we go?" he asked, his eyes searching mine, and I saw it, resolve, fierce and unyielding, as if he'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it, as if fate had brought us together to right a wrong decades in the making. Just like that, we were on the road, his old pickup trailing my car through the rain, the wipers slashing against the windshield, the world blurring as we raced back to Nashville, back to Daniel, back to the fragile hope that had sparked in that hospital courtyard. The hospital felt different when we arrived, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for a miracle to unfold. I led Luke through the sterile white halls, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, my steps quick and unsteady. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the linoleum floor, but I barely noticed. All I could think of was Daniel, lying in that room, his life hanging by a thread, and the man beside me who might be his salvation. Luke walked silently, his boots heavy against the floor, his face set with determination, but his eyes bright with something else. Hope, fear, maybe both. We reached the ICU, and I paused outside Daniel's door, my hand on the handle, my breath shallow, my heart racing. "Ready?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet resolve. I pushed open the door, and there he was, Daniel, awake, propped up by pillows, his face pale as ash, his skin almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, brightened when he saw me, a flicker of his old warmth breaking through the exhaustion. Then he saw Luke, and his expression shifted. Confusion, curiosity, then something deeper, something primal, like a memory stirring in his bones, a recognition he didn't yet understand. Luke stepped forward, his broad frame filling the doorway, his voice thick, rough with emotion. "I think I'm your brother," he said, the words hanging in the air like a prayer, heavy with meaning, heavy with hope. Daniel's mouth opened, his breath catching, tears welling in his eyes, shimmering under the fluorescent lights. "My brother," he whispered, his voice trembling, as if he couldn't believe the word, as if it was too big, too impossible to hold. They locked eyes. Two strangers bound by blood, seeing themselves in each other for the first time. Daniel's face was a mirror of Luke's. Same sharp jaw, same piercing blue eyes, same crooked half-smile, though Daniel's was faint, weakened by the illness that had ravaged him. Daniel reached out, his hand trembling, his fingers pale and thin, and Luke took it, his grip firm, steady, grounding, a lifeline across the years that had kept them apart. "We'll talk later," Luke said softly, his voice thick with unshed tears, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. "Right now, I'm here to save your life." The tests were expedited. Daniel's condition was deteriorating, every hour a race against time, a battle we couldn't afford to lose. I sat in the waiting room, my hands clasped so tightly my nails dug into my palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks in my skin. My eyes were fixed on the door, willing the hematologist to bring good news, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Every second felt like an eternity, the clock on the wall ticking too slowly, the air heavy with anticipation. When the hematologist stepped in, her smile was like sunlight breaking through a storm, a beacon in the darkness. "He's a strong match," she said, her voice steady but warm, her eyes meeting mine with quiet triumph. "One of the best we've seen in a long time. Luke's bone marrow is almost a perfect match for Daniel." I turned to Luke, tears streaming down my face, my voice breaking as I reached for his hand. "You're going to save him," I said, the words a sob, a prayer, a promise. He nodded, his jaw set, his eyes bright with determination, a fire burning behind them. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady, resolute, as if he'd been born for this moment. That night, I stood outside Daniel's room, giving the brothers space, leaning against the wall as their voices drifted through the door. They were tentative at first, cautious, like two people navigating a bridge that might collapse under their weight. Then they warmed, like a fire catching kindling, the words growing softer, more intimate. "I used to dream about having a brother," Daniel said, his voice breaking raw with emotion, each word heavy with years of longing. "Thought it was foolish, like dreaming of a house you'll never live in, a life you can't have. But here you are, real." Luke chuckled, his voice thick, almost choked with emotion. "Guess life had other plans, Danny," he said, a smile in his words. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I didn't know. I didn't know you existed. You don't have to be sorry, Daniel said, his voice stronger than I'd heard in weeks, a spark of his old fire breaking through. You're here now. That's what matters. When I stepped back into the room, Daniel looked at me, his eyes damp, a smile breaking through the exhaustion, transforming his face. I have a brother, M, he whispered, his voice trembling with wonder, with joy. I'm not alone. I knelt beside him, kissing his forehead, my tears mingling with his, my heart swelling with a love so fierce it hurt. You never were, I whispered back, my voice trembling with relief, with hope, with a gratitude I could barely contain. The transplant was a miracle, a gift we hadn't dared to hope for, a second chance snatched from the jaws of despair. Daniel's body accepted Luke's stem cells, and slowly, like a flower opening to the sun after a long winter, life returned to him. I watched for every sign, my heart leaping at each small victory, color creeping back into his cheeks, a steadier cadence to his voice, a stronger grip when he held my hand, his fingers warm and sure against mine. Luke stayed close, a constant presence, sleeping on a pull-out chair in the waiting area when hospital rules kept him from Daniel's room overnight. He never complained, never wavered, just watched his brother with quiet awe, as if he were witnessing a second chance, not just for Daniel, but for himself, for the family they'd both lost. Weeks later, Daniel took his first steps outside, shuffling carefully along the hospital's garden path, sunlight flickering through crimson and gold autumn leaves, their colors vibrant against the clear blue sky. He paused, tilting his face to the sun, breathing deeply, a smile spreading across his face. I forgot how good fresh air feels, he whispered, squeezing my hand, his fingers warm and steady, a promise of life returning. I smiled, tears blurring my vision, my heart swelling with a hope I'd thought was lost forever. When we brought him home to our little wooden house on the edge of Nashville, Luke followed in his old pickup, its engine rumbling like a heartbeat, a permanent part of our story now. The house felt different, fuller, warmer, as if it had been waiting for this reunion all along, its creaky floors and sagging porch embracing us all. The months that followed were a gift, a second chance we'd fought for with everything we had. Daniel grew stronger, his laugh echoing through our home once more, filling the spaces that had felt so empty, so silent. He started building furniture again, slower than before, his hands still weak, but guided by the same spark of creativity, the same love poured into every cut and curve. One evening, he called me out to the porch, his eyes bright with a secret. There, under the fading light of a Tennessee sunset, stood a new rocking chair, its wood polished to a warm glow, its edges carved with tiny stars, a mirror of the bookshelf he'd made years ago when we were young and dreaming. For you, he said simply, his voice steady, his smile wide and true. I sat, rocking gently, tears blurring my vision, as the chair creaked with a familiar warmth, a reminder of everything we'd overcome, of the love that had carried us through the darkest days. Luke became family, a permanent thread in the tapestry of our lives, his presence as natural as the sunrise. He joined us for Sunday dinners, the table crowded with plates of fried chicken, cornbread, and collard greens, the air filled with laughter and stories that wove us closer together. One night, as the firelight danced across our faces, Luke handed Daniel a small, worn pocket knife, its handle carved with their father's initials, the only piece of their past he had left. It's all I have of him, Luke said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes meeting Daniel's. I want you to have it. Daniel held it, his hands shaking, tears slipping silently down his cheeks as he traced the initials with his thumb, a tangible link to a history he'd never known, a piece of himself reclaimed after a lifetime of wondering. The people of Pine Hollow, strangers who'd become part of our story, sent cards, casseroles, handwritten prayers. Their kindness a reminder that goodness thrived, even in the hardest seasons. One note, tucked into a basket of homemade biscuits, read simply, "Family is everything. Hold each other close." I kept it, pinned beside Daniel's note by the kitchen door, a testament to the love that had carried us through, the community that had lifted us up. One golden evening, we walked a tree-lined road near Pine Hollow, the air crisp with autumn, leaves swirling in the breeze like embers from a fire. Daniel's hand was warm in mine, his steps steady, his smile brighter than I'd seen in months, a light that had returned to his eyes. Luke walked ahead, laughing as he carried his best friend's daughter on his shoulders, her giggles echoing through the trees, a sound of pure joy. Daniel paused, turning to me, his eyes soft, his voice quiet but sure. "You know," he said, "I used to think being an orphan meant I'd always be alone, that I'd never have anyone to call my own. But I was wrong. I have you. And now, I have him." I squeezed his hand, my heart swelling with a love so fierce it ached. "Family isn't always blood, Danny," I whispered, my voice trembling with gratitude. "But sometimes it is, and it's beautiful." That night, we sat around a bonfire behind Luke's house, the flames casting a warm glow on our faces, the air filled with the scent of burning cedar and the promise of new beginnings. I rested my head on Daniel's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest, listening to the brothers laugh, their voices weaving a new chapter in a story that had once seemed destined for tragedy. Life had betrayed us, disease, loss, a past that tore a family apart, but it had also given us this, a family forged in fire, a victory won against impossible odds, a love that refused to break. This is my story, a tale of whispers and secrets, of love that stood firm against the darkest storms, of a strength I found when I thought all was lost. Sometimes life strips you bare, takes everything you hold dear, leaves you standing in the ashes of your dreams. And sometimes, just when hope seems lost, it gives you exactly what you need, a brother found, a life renewed, a family made whole. Thank you for joining me on Elizabeth's Stories. If this tale of betrayal, resilience, and triumph touched your heart, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories that remind us of the power of hope and love. Share your own stories of second chances in the comments below. I read every one, and they mean the world to me. Until next time, hold your loved ones close and never stop fighting for what matters most.